This is Duke University.
All black, everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined today by Pastor Raphael G. Warnock, who is the senior pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, and the author of the new book, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness, just published by New York University Press. How are you doing today, Pastor Warnock?
Oh, it's great to be here with you, Mark. Thank you so much.
Our friend Michael Eric Dyson says of you, the author, Warnock brilliantly enhances the distinguished intellectual achievement of the historic Ebenezer pulpit by showing how Black and womanist theologies partner with the Black church to bring God's mighty word to bear on our souls and society all at once. That's high praise, Pastor.
Well, that is the objective, and Michael Dyson is very kind. I'm grateful.
So let's just get at it. You mentioned very early in the book, and we all remember when our friend and colleague Eddie Glaude announced that the Black church is dead. In many ways, your book is a response to that, to the questions that are the crisis, if you will, that's presented by this idea that the Black church is functioning as a divided mind. Talk a little bit about your thinking about writing the book and what you were trying to respond to.
Well, as I sat down to write The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness, it really is the manifestation of thinking that I've been doing on this issue for quite a long time. I'm a pastor, a child and product, if you will, of the Black church. And when I speak of the divided mind of the Black church, I'm not speaking about something that is inherently negative. I'm really pointing to the creative tension between this emphasis in Black Christianity in particular, but Christian faith in general. On the one hand, this focus on the care of souls, the formation of the individual as a spiritual person, and then on the other hand, this focus on social justice, social transformation. And I argue that that's the central tension of Black Christianity, and the ways in which it has, at its best, held those two things together has been a gift really to the American churches, and has been the conscience of the American churches. And I call it back to the best of that tradition, to which is not always true.
You know, one of the things that struck me, and you mentioned this very early in the book, about the idea that the Black church was born fighting for freedom. And I'm just reminded, as many readers will be reminded, that, you know, even the creation of the Black church was a political act. But very often when we sit in these pews on Sunday mornings, and whatever message we're hearing, whether or not it's a message of prosperity or really just really focused on saving our individual souls, I think somehow that longer history of the political aspects, the political importance, the radical importance of even creating a space to have a Black church, I'm not sure folks who sit in congregations every Sunday morning are reminded of that particular legacy.
I'm deeply concerned about that, Mark, and that's why I wrote the book. I think that the problem that you place your finger on is a part of a larger cultural problem in the United States of America, right? That ours is a culture that does suffer from a kind of historical amnesia about things important that have to do with the formation of the nation itself. And so it's not surprising that the people who sit in the pews of Black churches are disconnected from that larger history. And in the decades following the death of Martin Luther King Jr., with a burgeoning Black middle class, with some who've been the beneficiaries of a kind of upward mobility, that disconnect becomes even more exacerbated. And so the book is both a historical reflection on who we are. It's not a romanticization of the Black church, although I'm a pastor in that church. I'm really trying to engage it in a nuanced way to talk about who we are at our best, but also who we haven't, the ways in which we have not managed to live up to the best of that idealism, and really a call to arms, a charge to reconnect to that liberationist legacy. I argue, in essence, that the Black church was born fighting for freedom, that freedom is not some extracurricular activity. Freedom fighting is not just one item along a long list of things that one might decide to do. that is central to the church's very raison d'etre. And to the extent that the Black church is not true to that tradition, it sells its own birthright. And in that sense, Eddie Glaude is right. If it isn't dead, it certainly will die a slow and painful death.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Pastor Raphael G. Warnock, who is the senior pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, and the author of the new book, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness, just published by New York University Press. One of the things I'd like to get into, you talk about these movements in terms of history of the Black church. When it's an invisible institution, when it becomes an independent Black church movement, the civil rights movement is this kind of particularly important moment, and then the birth of Black theology that comes, in response to what we see during the civil rights movement. Can you talk a little bit about these individual movements and how those movements continue to shape at least your vision of where the Black church should be at this point?
So yes, thank you so much. So I argue that this notion of the Black church as a radical institution, and I like the way you put it earlier, that the formation of the Black church itself was a political act. Yeah. It was what Black folk could conceivably achieve and do at that moment in their history. And it is from that independent movement that a later generation would then challenge the contradictions in the larger society itself. But I lay out the history of the Black church in 4 distinctive moments or turning points, if you will. And that isn't to say that there aren't moments in between that aren't important, but because I think that they represent, they're helpful in terms of helping to understand where we are right now and where we need to go. So that first moment that I identify is the formation of a liberationist faith. That's the invisible institution. That's Black folk in the hush harbors of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, forming their own sort of Christian communions in the dark night under the dark cloak of night, long after the official meetings were over, where the master preached, slaves, obey your master. They had their own view of the faith. Albert J. Rabateau said that the difference between the slaves' Christianity and the slave master's Christianity was wide and deep. Howard Thurman said, by some amazing but vastly creative spirituality, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned in his midst. And so that is to say that slaves weren't simply converted to Christianity, that in a real sense, they converted Christianity itself, transformed it into a liberationist faith. We see that in the working out of the Exodus motif in slave religion and after that. So that's the first moment, the formation of a liberationist faith. The second moment is the founding of a liberationist church, and that's that independent Black church movement that we like to talk about, out of which comes Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and George Lowell and Andrew Bryan down in Savannah, Georgia, where I'm from, forming the First African Baptist Church. These Black churches, these Black denominations, organizing their own autonomous spaces, not out of a kind of segregationist tenet, but really out of a sense that of one blood God has made all nations to dwell upon the face of the earth, a kind of egalitarian push that says that we believe in this, and if we have to create autonomous spaces to live in that until the rest of the country catches up, then so be it. So that's the second moment. And then Dr. King's movement and those who worked with him, the unnamed and unnumbered martyrs who died alongside him, they constitute that third moment, the fomenting of a church-led liberationist movement. At its height, it's a multiracial movement across religious lines. But at the heart of it is really that independent Black church movement. You would not have had a civil rights movement without a Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And you would not have a Southern Christian Leadership Conference had there not been an independent Black church movement. So that's the third moment. And it's critical, it's important for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is that it is important is because Dr. King, through his preachments, through his activism, as the intellectual of the movement, he really brought into sharp focus the meaning of that Christian faith that was formed by enslaved ancestors decades before him. He stood on the shoulders of his father, who was a pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, who led a voting rights campaign in 1935. His maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, fighting helping to form the NAACP here in Atlanta, fighting for the first high school for colored children then to attend. So that is to say that while he leads this national movement in the age of television, which gives it a kind of focus and force, he stands on the shoulders of a kind of Black liberationist tradition. And then out of that comes the forging of a systematic liberationist theology. That's James Cone and others, womanist theology, developing as a part of that movement. And then I argue as a pastor, as a Black theologian, as one with deep appreciation for the insights of womanist theology, I argue for the need for a fifth moment, the flowering of a self-critical liberationist theology where we challenge the Black church and Black theology to come out of their respective silos of ecclesial and academic privilege, and that we would interrogate ourselves, that it is a contradiction for us to be radical on race, conservative on issues of human sexuality, gender equality, silent and mute on issues of climate change, brown sisters and brothers who are fighting to be recognized as human beings in this struggle for immigration in America. I argue for a fifth moment.
Now, you know this more than anybody, but the two of us, we were up in Baltimore, Maryland a few months ago at Bethel, for a tribute to our brother, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. And one of the tensions, at least in that particular moment of what was a weekend, looking at this kind of tradition of Black theology, is this idea that part of the critique that you get from the theologians is that the rank and file pastors aren't intellectual enough. And of course, part of the critique that you're getting from the rank and file folks, the folks who are in the churches every week, is that the intellectuals aren't, connected to a spiritual. How do we work through this particular moment? And it's not something that can necessarily be done in any kind of vacuum. I mean, there are real issues that we absolutely need the Black church wholly minded, to address at this period of time. How do we get past, and I don't want to call it bickering because, people are invested in what they're invested in. And both sides of that coin matter to us, who want to see the community go forward. But how do we really push it forward?
Yeah, that is you put your finger right on the urgency, the sense of urgency out of which my text comes. Here I am, all theology, all academic critical reflection is autobiographical. And so here I am, the son of two Pentecostal preachers, trained and raised in that tradition, went on and trained with James. I'm situated in Dr. King's pulpit. And so I have a deep appreciation for all the cross currents that you named there. And I think the theologians are right. There is unfortunately this strand of anti-intellectualism that runs not only through the Black church, but through the American churches, through church. And that's why you need theologians and ethicists and biblical scholars to kind of keep us intellectually honest about certain things. And so the theologians are right about that. But I also think that the pastors are right, that sometimes Black theology has posited a kind of revolutionary gaze that is not appreciative, not deeply appreciative enough of the kind of spiritual fervor and commitment that's necessary even to maintain the kind of commitment to revolution that we saw during the civil rights movement, and is not attentive enough to the daily silences between revolutionary moments where people are just trying to figure out how to raise their children, how to pay their bills, make $1 out of 15 cents, how to keep their sanity in the midst of all of these struggles.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Pastor Raphael G. Warnock, who is the senior pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. He's the author of the new book, The Divided Mind of the Black Church. Theology, Piety, and Public Witness, just published by New York University Press. It goes without saying, and I imagine you get this question all the time, what does it mean to preside in the pulpit at Ebenezer Baptist Church at this particular moment, given historically what it's meant to the black community and America, if we're going to be quite honest?
Well, it is the highest honor of my life. I've been here now for about 8.5 years, and yeah, I do get that question quite a bit. And I think part of if we've had any effectiveness at all, I think part of that has been because I've been very clear from day one that I was not called here to walk in Dr. King's shoes, but rather to try to stand on his shoulders, even as he stood on the shoulders of others who came before him. I don't want to be the next Dr. King. I want to do a pretty good job at being the first Raphael Warnock. And standing in this great church with this tradition of activism, which didn't begin with Martin Luther King Jr., is situated in the ministry of his father and his maternal grandfather. This is an exciting moment to be here, where we're living in this sort of contradiction where you've got an African-American president, but we're certainly clear by now that we don't live in a post-racial world. So it's in that contradiction of here we go again, if you will, where many of the discriminations against which Dr. King and others marched, voting rights, employment, housing, all of those issues are now situated, for example, on a new terrain that Michelle Alexander rightly identifies as the new Jim Crow. That you have this burgeoning black middle class, but you have a lot of suffering people, and you have a criminal justice system and a prison industrial complex that is clearly more staunchly racist and unrepentant of that fact than was the case during Dr. King's ministry. We had 300,000 people in America's prisons in 1980. 30 years after that, we have well over 2 million, over half of them African Americans, most of them there for non-violent drug-related offenses, although white sisters and brothers and black sisters and brothers use and sell drugs.
The same rate. Right.
At the same rate. Yeah. So this deep contradiction where we've got more black people in prison in the United States of America than were in prison in South Africa during the height of apartheid. So the question is, what kind of regime, if you will, are we living under that transcends whoever's in the White House at the moment? And what is the black church called to do? What are black theologians called to do? And I think if we put that at the center of the dialogue, we would both be called out of our respective enclaves of privilege.
One last question. I grew up in New York City, came to my political consciousness in the mid-1980s. One of the figures who stood out a great deal to me was Calvin Butz. In terms of doing the work that he needed to do to build Abyssinian Baptist Church. Of course, this is the legacy of Adam Clayton Powell Jr. That he's also building in this context, but also being active and vocal in a way that, at least growing up, I had not seen many black church figures, save the kind of figures like the James Cones and the Martin Luther King and James Forbes and those kind of figures. You worked with Reverend Butz. Talk a little bit about your time at Abyssinian.
Yes, Dr. Butz is my pastor. I served there at Abyssinian Baptist Church for 10 years while I was a student at Union Theological Seminary. So I spent my days with James Cone, and I spent many afternoons, evenings, and weekends hanging out with Calvin Butz. And so I like to think of those years as me moving kind of on a kind of running train between Jerusalem and Athens, between the ivory towers and ebony trenches. And it is that conversation that I'm trying to lift up in the book. Certainly I've been inspired in many ways by the activism of Dr. Butz, who challenged cigarette companies in the late 1980s to stop targeting, and alcohol companies stop targeting communities of color. And then at the same time, while challenging big corporate interests and their desire to exploit the poor, challenging the poor also to think about their behavior, those decisions, personal responsibility, public policy. And he embodies that in a brilliant way, and certainly is part of the inspiration for what I do.
We've been joined this afternoon, and thankfully so, by Pastor Raphael Warnock. He is the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in the ATL. He's the author of the new book, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness, just published by New York University Press. Thank you for joining us, Pastor.
Thank you. What a pleasure to be here with you. And I'm encouraged when you said the ATL. That means you get it. That's
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.